Okay, great. I would just like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work and deliver this paper. I wish to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people's sovereignty over this land was never ceded and that struggles relating to reconciliation, rights and justice remain ongoing. And I also want to acknowledge and pay my respects to any Indigenous elders that are joining us today or retrospectively as this becomes broadcast or whatever. I just want to take this opportunity to offer a brief outline of my human-snake relations research project in Australia, which started off at the start, began at the start of this year, specifically by focusing on what unique conceptual, methodological, and substantive contributions it can hopefully make to critical animal studies or emancipatory animal studies, and so on and so forth, while also acknowledging some of the methodological challenges and existential risk of being with and for this particular creature. The acute feelings of agitation, hysteria, and outrage that typically mediate public encounters with snakes, especially those that are venomous, and the routinized violence these organisms suffer seems entirely disproportionate to the threat they pose statistically or harm they actually leverage in everyday life. Indeed, it has been estimated that approximately 3,000 snakebite events occur each year in Australia, of which 550 people are admitted to hospital, 100 result in severe envenomation, and approximately 2 each year result in death. Juxtapose this figure with the 20 or so horse-related fatalities that occur each year, or the 1,200 people who lose their lives on Australia's roads annually. Regardless, the outcome of these intensities is continuous conflict over the unbelonging of snakes in domestic, specifically suburban milieu, and the need for them to be absented from the landscape despite their evolutionary and ecological significance and extended presence within it. For these and other reasons, snakes as biosocial agents are intriguing and ambiguous figures to not only think, but I've also found work and become with. In what follows, I touch on some of my current research that is bound up with my role as a licensed snake worker and the forms of intimate attunement, but also ambivalent responsibility, to quote Donna Haraway, orientating my complex relationship with this socially oppressed and marginalized creature. Just to throw up here, I guess, I'm not going to spend much time on this. It's something I'm fascinated with, but the ways in which snakes have this really fascinating kind of visuality as kind of boundary entries in terms of how they've been historically and culturally figured and objectified as symbols within complex systems of meaning, which are very much culturally and historically situated. Snakes come in a multiplicity of representations, and I've just drawn your attention, it took me a while to put the slide together, to some of the ways in which snakes are figured within hegemonic frameworks and narratives. And I'm really interested, actually, because I think a lot of what I see in my work with these amazing creatures out in wild contexts and less than wild contexts in terms of people's backyards, is how snakes have entered and permeated our consciousness and cultures as this deeply symbolic figure. And of course, as you'll all be aware, snakes have been associated with some of the oldest rituals and represent dual expressions of good and evil, death and rebirth, which very much signify the creative and destructive aspects of nature that kind of flows through this creature that is the snake as it slithers into people's lives and dreams and practices and cultural practices. And so snakes are multiply scripted entities and artifacts. Snakes mean, symbolize and signify very different things depending on who and where you are. They can be revered, feared and loathed in the same event, the same breath in a sense. How we understand snakes, therefore, is closely bound to our cultural situatedness and our exposure to these various representations that are socially and culturally contingent. In Australia, we can see marked distinctions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, for example, meanings and understandings of snakes as being mystical and spirit-laden creatures which were harbingers of particular energies and entities, to them being cast by Western settler populations as a problem to be violently eliminated from the landscape, which I think is gruesomely and brutally depicted in this scene I've sort of highlighted down there, I hope you can see in red, you know, this is this kind of quantification of killing, systematic killing of 118 tiger snakes in 2 hours on the Murray-Darling. And so for a range of reasons, a white colonial mentality that incorporates various religious, imperial and anthropocentric convictions and intolerance for certain forms of endemic wildlife, I would argue has historically constructed snakes as problem creatures to be violently eliminated from the landscape through culling practices in processes of purification. And this disposition, which very much endures in the present day alongside proprietorial frameworks of purified space and suburban expansion, renders snakes, notwithstanding the fact they are listed as a protected species now, killable when they transgress domestic boundaries and appear on or in properties. Bit more context. I really see these wonderful creatures that I spend a lot of my time with and energies with as being framed as these kind of unbelonging boundary creatures. About 1 in 3 adults apparently are ophidiophobic, making this one of the most common reported phobias. Snakes, as I've kind of suggested through a lot of the representations, and I absolutely acknowledge, they're not exclusively represented as malign creatures. I know they come in a range of different kinds of symbolisms, but nonetheless, some of the dominant hegemonic narratives construct them in this way as evil, sinister creatures, you know, and very much have this kind of idea of the snake being an untrustworthy and corrupting figure. And I'm sure you can sort of note the biblical references there coming through here. A signifier of dirt, impurity, and evil, a weaponized creature via its toxin load and constriction techniques and capacity to inflict lethal harm. So these kinds of stories and meanings that we kind of impose upon this creature, I would argue, have kind of conspired to generate this kind of, exclusionary kind of gaze, a gaze of problematization, a gaze of marginality and oppression that this creature experiences in its everyday life as it relates with humans, particularly. It's an archetypal figure of wildness, difference, and exoticism, and that's something I find really fascinating. That, you know, for me, living in Australia, for many people I interview in my research I do on human snake and public understandings of snakes, it really generates this sense of the wild coming in to this privatized, territorialized space of the domestic realm, and how dare this figure transgress those boundaries, those human boundaries that we have assembled and constructed, these kind of angular spaces that we have made. How dare this slithery creature, you know, wind its way across those things, and it doesn't belong here. And that's a constantly kind of narrative I'm exposed to by people's houses I go to remove these snakes, these terrible pariah species. And it's often that sort of sense of like, why is it here? And I say, well, they've been here for millions of years. They're, but yet this idea of, this artificial kind of social construction of space is very, very interesting here. One of the features I think about this othering of snakes is this notion that we can't recognize or perceive ourselves in snakes in terms of their appearance, their movements, their biomechanics, physiologies, and their practices. And I kind of want to just draw your attention here to exactly what I mean in terms of practices. This is one snake consuming another snake in an act of, from a human construction of, what this act is, of cannibalism, and the fact that some snakes, will leave their eggs or give birth to live lump and just leave them from that point on to fend for themselves, and there's no kind of maternalistic instincts or caring instincts or whatever. So it's this way that we look at their, in very reductionist ways, very simplified ways, their everyday social lives, and we differentiate ourselves off from that figure of the snake. And we have this kind of thing I call disgust reflex, which I keep, again, encountering in my work in terms of when these creatures appear in particular spaces. Now, the upshot of this, and I'm sorry for the awful image, I know some of you will be quite shocked and disgusted and appalled and outraged, and so you should be, because this image you can see here, and I'm going to play this video very briefly, is exactly the kind of scene that unfortunately I have to currently encounter in my work with these creatures. This is a snake that was deliberately, purposefully killed by a person in a car who saw the snake on the road and deliberately swerved out of the way of where they should be driving to run over the snake and then reverse back over it and leave it for dead. for me to find and to unfortunately have to euthanize myself to put it out of this awful suffering set of injuries this poor brown snake was in. And I've just put some images up here. There's me with yet another dead brown snake that was killed on the roads. And I have to deal with this a lot, this kind of really confronting work of a creature I really admire and respect, having to just face this constant violence and its elimination from our human-centric world. And so, yeah, I guess, you know, these kinds of messages I've put up here, the only good snake is a dead one, will be very familiar to our Australian colleagues who are tuning in here, as a kind of a real parable that dominates the public imaginary. And I get this time and time and time again on my website, my Facebook page, where I run my snake work, service. And, you know, this kind of thing, just cut their heads off and then smash it head in with a rock. That really is an attitude that is fairly prevalent, I would say. And anyway, so this is why I do what I do. I really love these creatures. I think they're absolutely incredibly sensorial, mystic, cryptic, wise, hypersensitive animals. And this is the kind of places I find them in when I'm called out during the warmer periods in Canberra. And you can see the publicness of these appearances of mainly large brown snakes, living right beside someone's front door. This was their front door here, inside a primary school, someone's back of someone's fridge, the ANU University, the Arboretum. These creatures don't respect those kinds of physical territorial boundaries that we put up and instantiate. And their movements through these spaces obviously causes all this kind of public affect and requires people like me to come along and, like this is the hotel.
Let's get it off you.
Inside the lobby.
Completely trapped there, so you've done a good job of holding him in there. Hello, buddy. Yeah. Pleased to see me as always.
And here's another nice one that I think you might like. This was a snake inside someone's boot, a red belly black snake inside someone's boot outside their house.
It's funny, young one as well. No, I haven't actually. This is I just want to get this tail out. There you go. Oh, nearly. Get this tail out. There you go. Here.
Yeah.
This is fun. That's a beautiful snake.
Yeah, he is. The colour. It's not showing up very well on the screen.
Is it not?
And I mean, you can hear me there. You probably think I'm a bit mad, and that's fine. But you can hear me there communicating in my own very human ways with the snake, and saying to it, "It's okay, just calm down. Everything's going to be fine." And I do that a lot, different forms of communication with it, quite a, not just a verbal level. A lot of what I do is about, trying to calm the creature down that feels really threatened and scared, and just trying to offer it a safe space to take it out of a situation where it may well come to harm, or of course, in fact, it may also do some harm if it has an interaction with a human or a pet, a domestic pet, for example. This is what I do. I mean, I work with and for snakes. That's kind of my job. I love doing this work. I really, it's very difficult work. It's very physical work. There's a lot of emotionality in it too. But what I really find important about what I do is kind of trying to unsilence these creatures. Of course, these creatures can't communicate through verbal. They can't, communicate in the ways that we humans do. But they certainly do communicate a lot, and they tell you, how they are feeling in particular situations. And I guess I just want to recognize the snake's agency, and really have this, animal-centered research that I'm really, engaged in. And I do that in terms of the education that I'm engaged in too. And you can see put up there, I run a particular Facebook page where I try and inform the public about these creatures, and try and, show them in different light, and give them a bit of a story as well. And I know, I'm imposing my meaning system onto this animal, but I think based on the feedback I get often, it is actually helping for people to come to a more coexistent kind of framework of living with these creatures rather than excluding them in quite often violent ways from the spaces they inhabit. And this is the kind of scenes that I quite regularly again encounter is snakes in trouble, snakes in distress. The one thing I really enjoy about my work is being able to sometimes give this, and it's a bit of I'm playing a bit here with bit of I can't even think of the word at the moment. Anyway, snakes are obviously limbless creatures, and so sometimes they need a bit of a hand because they get themselves caught and trapped in all sorts of situations that kinds of human objects that we've made that kind of end up being where these snakes tend to live and habitate, but also can pose risks to these kinds of creatures as well. So part of my job is kind of freeing them, extricating them from situations of harm that they found themselves in. And obviously, taking them along to the vet when they've been predated upon by, in this case, a cat that was not a housebound cat. And that's a very common aspect of things I come across again in this sort of multi-species way of the conflicts between different creatures and species, not just human, but also obviously more than human too, and having to sort of deal with some of those issues as well. And this is just a nice little demonstration of why I do it, but it's also a bit of a problem of what I do, because what I tend to do is I catch these snakes in the most stress-free way as I can, and then I transport them arbitrarily to some kind of drop-off point in the bush where they're released and for them to get on with their lives. And of course, in my very human-centric way, I think I'm doing a good thing. I think I'm being virtuous, helping this creature out. But what I don't, of course, know is what effects, what implications that work of translocation and recirculation, as I've mentioned here, is having on that particular animal, but also the animals already endemic in that release site. So this is, I'm not going to have time to talk about that just now, unfortunately, today, but that is the next stage of my project, which is a snake telemetry project. If there's time and questions, we can maybe come to that in a second, but I'm keen to sort of see what happens to these folks when these lovely creatures, when they're released, whether, the survivor rate, what kinds of movement ecology we can kind of derive from that. This is just to move on, getting towards the end. I guess snake catching or snake work is very much for me an event and a flow. And it's one of these things that it's kind of hard to put into words, really, because, for people that aren't aware, these snakes that I'm working with on a daily basis are highly, highly venomous snakes. And if you're bitten by one of them, it can be very, very, very serious. And so it's one of these kinds of practices that I'm fascinated in as a sociologist, this kind of edge work that is part of this kind of, being for snakes. And I love this quote from Davison, a cultural geographer, saying, "Nature is performed by human agents in a dance with other than human agency, a dance of necessity, partially improvised as well as partially scripted." And I really feel that beautifully summarizes this kind of repertoire that you develop as a snake catcher, where it's mostly intuitive practice that requires species attunement, kinematic, eye-hand coordination, muscle memory, the capacity to improvise and emotion work. And you sort of learn these very basic techniques on a training courses. And of course, you're then left on your own, exposed to these creatures to kind of fine-tune your art, your craft of safely and efficiently getting these creatures in the bag to take them somewhere safer. Again, I put these in inverted commas. And it's just this interesting thing where I sort of see snake work as this colliding situation or multi-species context, in that you have all of these different energies and atmospheres and biographies coming together in the event of snake work, which is the snake's biography, how the snake is feeling, how hormonal it is, how out of place it is, how much it's been chased around with a spade by someone first. And then obviously into the catcher's biography and how they're feeling approaching that snake, what kinds of sentiments are going through their heads, what kind of research, I better hurry up and finish off. Anyway, and the audience and atmosphere, because my last kind of point I was going to make here was that, you know, I think what's very interesting here, and this is something I'm going to write a lot more about very soon too, is this work is it's so much of a spectacle, a cultural performance, where you have, and you've highlighted here, this crowd that often, you know, follows you around as a snake catcher in terms of where the snake is and want to video you. And it all becomes a kind of an intermediated spectacle of you safely, hopefully, catching the snake, and all the failure that comes from that too, where sometimes you don't catch the snake. Sometimes the agency of the creature outwits you, outsmarts you, outmaneuvers you. But it's this kind of expectation that you, as this kind of purifier of the disorder in the space, as the snake catcher comes along and restores order to this kind of space that's been transgressed by this boundary object. So I just want to read out one little bit from my ethnography I'm doing on this work. I'm on my way to my daughter's school for the annual spring fete when I get called from the school janitor, who is highly agitated. There's an eastern brown snake literally in the middle of the children's activities. I get ushered into the area and a crowd of 100 or so people are circling the rock under which the snake is taking shelter. The immediate area is cordoned off with the tape and beware snake signs. I feel a tremendous amount of both pressure and excitement as I approach the area and see the snake's head poking out of a hole. Many people, including lots of small children and anxious parents, are gathered, some of whom are filming the event. This is a risky situation, as if the snake escapes, it is likely to head towards people milling about the site at high speed. One of the janitor props up the rock and the snake exits the other side, leaving me a split second to move and catch the snake by the tail and then safely place it in the catch bag. The crowd all clap and cheer rapturously. I breathe an audible sigh of relief while simultaneously feel a surge of adrenaline and euphoria pumping through my body. And just to give you a sense to finish on why I conceptualize this very much as edge work, is this kind of response these creatures can be, when provoked and interfered with, can be really, really quick, agile, and can strike and very fast. And much faster reflexes than I have. And so you have to constantly be on your game doing this kind of work the whole time. And, you know, of course, these snakes are only to defend themselves where they see you as this big kind of looming threat and predator. And so, you know, I don't take this personally at all, but, you know, you're constantly aware of the, you know, the potential perils that come from doing this work. I'll finish there. I think I've had my time. Sorry about that if I've gone too far, Zoe.
You're the last one anyway on our list, so I think that's quite a wrap. Do we have questions for Gavin? Oh, actually, I'm going to start with this question that Adam's popped in the chat. Regarding translocation and the impact of translocation on snakes, if your work on translocation shows that it is problematic for snakes, what implication do you think that will have? Are there ways of existing with snakes in situ, or are snakes too feared for that to work?
Oh, it's such a great question, Adam. And yeah, I mean, look, I have this horrible feeling that although I've presented myself as being for snakes, which I certainly am, a big advocate for them, big fan of them, but I worry about the work I do with them. I mean, I'm moving hundreds of snakes around Canberra and surrounding Canberra as I do my work, you know, and I've got no idea what kind of harm I'm creating by that action. And although I think I'm doing the right thing for this creature, and I didn't even talk about all the care stuff I do for them as well. And remember, these are animals that you really have to be careful with. You know, if you make a mistake, if you lapse in concentration, you get bitten, and it can be really, really serious. So, but I think if this study that I'm going to do, the snake telemetry project, which I'm starting off, hopefully at the start of this coming season, it warms up here, I suspect I'm going to find that the snakes I move around are much more vulnerable. Why? Because they're disorientated, they're incredibly attuned to the environment, very sensitive to it. They know where all the thermal regulation spots are. And by kind of dropping it off arbitrarily, the snake, I suspect, tries to orientate back to its home range, and in the process becomes really vulnerable. So I hope to influence Adam, the kind of the policies around relocation. And of course, my passion is to educate people to leave snakes alone and to appreciate and respect them, and to not see them as these monstrous, evil, sinister creatures, but rather absolutely critical parts of the ecosystem.
Now, Josephine has a question as well. Do you want to unmute?
How's that?
Yes, good.
Yeah, thank you so much for that amazing talk. I love snakes as well. I was just wondering if your work is also examining those sorts of discourses around attitudes and like the Australian story about snakes, and in particular if you're looking at any gendered aspects around that.
Yeah, great question, Josephine. I mean, yes, I am. Slowly. This is kind of a project that's a passion project that is kind of bundled up with other projects I'm doing. And so I haven't done as much as I'd like to on that front of the symbolic realm aspect and the gendering. I mean, certainly in terms of snake catching, I'm very interested in gender and snake catching and this kind of, bullfighting kind of, hegemonic kind of masculinity / outsider / kind of Steve Irwin, Bushman kind of appearance and facade that often, is part of this kind of snake work, this kind of, a very gendered domination over the environment and through the kinds of risky creatures of it, and the sort of symbolic status and virtue snake catchers tend to have in Australia. But equally, there's lots and lots of, female snake catchers. I'm kind of fascinated too, in terms of trying to understand why they became snake catchers, how they narrate that, what the differences are, and absolutely agree with you around, attitudes to snakes and how they might relate to all these kinds of social positionalities. I think is a fascinating question. And so I'm very gradually hoping that this work will open up a conversation between me and some of my Indigenous friends, colleagues, to, just to explore different cultural situatedness of what the snake means and its kind of relation to, different kinds of, epistemologies around living in environment. So in a sense, the snake is opening lots of things up for me, which I'm really excited about and I'm really grateful for that creature.
I've just got one more question from Amit, and then I might open it up to general discussion if anyone's keen. Amit's talking about the situation with snakes in India. India is at the top in snake bites and mortality is quite high, but there aren't any snake catchers. So people often find themselves in panicking situations, and there's a tendency of killing snakes as people see them. One aspect is telling people about the ecological role of snakes or cultural role, but when you have that direct encounter, awareness isn't really enough. So what kinds of sociological methods could you suggest to change this anti-snake sentiment?
Oh, such a great question. And commentary. And look, I hope 50 minutes, as we all know, it's compressed, but I hope I haven't in any way downplayed the significance of the fact that snakes, particular elapid snakes, are highly venomous in certain places. And this is a structural question about health infrastructure. It's a structural question about education. It's a structural question about overcrowding, density, and all these kinds of things that I think lead to this kind of violent kind of event that is the human-snake conflict. So that is a question that I think would require me to speak for some time about, cultural situatedness and the fact that, in some of those places you're talking about, Amit, there's obviously not anti-venom readily available. There's not ambulances. There's not necessarily the awareness of what, how to deal with envenomation or potential envenomation. In Australia, obviously, we do have pretty good health infrastructure compared to lots of other places, and quite a lot of knowledge around about what to do in the event of a snake bite. But obviously, my sense is a lot of it is the problem of that cultural figuring of the creature as this kind of malign, completely dehumanized sort of figure on the margins, on the edges, that means us harm. And once you start actually working with these creatures on a day-to-day basis, become intimately familiar with their energy fields, you realize they're really not about causing humans harm. There's obviously accidents of people standing on them and them getting into people's houses, and they're just really unlucky and unfortunate things. But for the most part, the snake just wants to get away from humans, and who can blame them?